This is the 5th tutorial in a series on the Home Cost Allocation tool. In the last segment, we explored the Selection of Method worksheet, and now we will be using the Standard Method worksheet to evaluate the project identified as Case Study C in our earlier segment on the comparability of units. As a brief reminder, anytime the units in a project are not comparable, a PJ must designate fixed home units and use the standard method of cost allocation. But it's also important to note that the standard method is acceptable in all cases. A PJ can always choose to use the standard method even if the units are comparable. And in practice, if the PJ is choosing to designate fixed home units, then the standard method is going to be your best choice since we know the exact units that will be home assisted. In using the standard method worksheet, there are several inputs that users need to pull from other project documentation. Most of these are also needed for the other method-specific worksheets, which we'll see later. First, the standard method sheet will be pulling total residential square footage of the project from the Selection of Method worksheet. Note that the total residential square footage, as we discussed in the tutorial on unit comparability, is based on the interior space of the residential units, the space the tenant actually sees. This is different than the gross square footage of the development, which would include all of the common areas like hallways, community rooms, and the like. We also need both the total development cost and the subtotal of costs that have been deemed ineligible for home funding. Remember, in most cases, you will be conservative in calculating this and may err on the side of treating some cost as ineligible. If some units have upgraded amenities and finishes, for example higher-end appliances, fireplaces, or premium kitchens, we need to know the cost of those upgrades compared to the standard finishes for other units. And finally, if there are costs associated with providing relocation benefits required by the Uniform Relocation Act, then we want to have those in their own line item. As the notice covers in more detail, HUD allows URA-related relocation costs to be treated either as a common cost of the project or to attribute those costs exclusively to the home units. In practice, most PJs choose to treat relocation, when it applies, as a common cost, and doing so simplifies the cost allocation process. As we've discussed before, cost allocation can follow two different paths. We can work from dollars to units, determining how many home units are needed based on a given level of investment. That's the most common way to do things. But sometimes we go the other way and need to calculate the cost of a given set of units to see how much home could potentially be awarded, subject to later underwriting. We talk about this as the units to dollars path. The standard method can be used for either of these scenarios. When going from dollars to units, PJs will assign specific units in the project as home assisted until the total eligible cost of those units equals or exceeds the proposed home investment. And in the smaller number of cases, where we're going from units to dollars, the standard method sheet will calculate the eligible cost of those units and compare that to the maximum project subsidy. This, in turn, establishes a maximum investment level that still needs to be evaluated as part of underwriting. So with that, let's take a look at an example based on Case Study C, the project we first introduced in the segment on unit comparability. In this segment, we're demonstrating the standard method of cost allocation. If you remember from our prior segment when we did the Selection of Method page, we were using Case Study C. So we see that information here. And again, what you can do from that page is scroll down and there's actually a hyperlink to the standard method because that's the option we can choose. Now, I've already started to fill some of this out just to save us some time. The first thing that I'll point out is that the gross residential square footage actually pulls over automatically from the Selection of Method page, but it's still a yellow cell. So if you needed to, you could overwrite that. Sometimes what happens is the overall residential square footage is just a little bit different than what gets calculated because of the way we enter numbers usually as whole numbers. If you do that, let's say that we took a different number here, it's going to give you a warning and says the square footage you've entered does not align with the calculated amount. That's not always a problem, but you want to be aware of it, so it's highlighting that for you. I'm going to go back though and just use the gross residential square footage as we calculated. In this specific example, we've got a proposed investment of $1.25 million in home. We have a total development cost in this project of $15,860,259. I'm going to enter that here. That's what goes on line 3. And our ineligible development cost go on line 4 at $1,510,60. Now before I go any further, I want to show you one way that advanced users might modify this sheet. What I've done is I've actually dropped a new worksheet into the overall workbook where I put the budget for this project. And so what we've done is the same thing we did earlier in the segment on identifying eligible and ineligible cost. We flagged those costs out of the total development costs that are suspect or clearly home ineligible, and we have our total development cost in one column and our ineligible cost in another. If I do that, what I can actually do is I can tie this cell to that spreadsheet with a formula, and the same thing here, so that I can modify things later as numbers become clearer. But we have eligible cost of almost $15.6 million, ineligible cost of just over $1.5 million. We have no unit-specific upgrades. This would be the cost of adding premium amenities to specific units. In this case, the project doesn't have any. We also don't have any relocation cost. Many projects don't, of course. So we have a base project cost of $14.35 million and a square footage cost of the residential square footage of $330 a square foot. Now that is quite a little bit expensive, but in this specific instance, the project actually has quite a bit of common space. The residential square footage up here is purely the space inside the units, and it's an adaptive reuse of a historic building, so it's quite pricey in a lot of respects. I've gone ahead and entered the several units that we're going to designate as home. These all came off of the sheet that we saw in the comparability segment. So units 103, 104, 105, 108, 109, 106, and 107. We have several that are one bedrooms and several that are two bedroom units. Of course, you would type these in, but I've gone ahead and entered it so we save some time here. Once we enter the square footage of unit 103, what the computer does is calculates the cost. The $330 a square foot times the 970 square feet gives you the cost of that individual unit. So we'll go ahead and enter the others. And when we're done assigning the units, what we will see is that the total cost of this group of units is almost $1.6 million. That takes us now to the next step in the overall cost allocation process, and we have to calculate the maximum project subsidy. So we have 5 one-bedroom units that have been designated at home as home. We got the number from our field office. The maximum per unit subsidy is $160,615. The maximum subsidy for a 2-bedroom unit is $195,304. So 2 times the 195 figure gives us the 390. The maximum subsidy for this project from home is only $1.193 million. That's because these are really expensive units and we're above the maximum per unit subsidy. So when we go down here, what this sheet shows us is that even though we proposed initially to provide $1.25 million, and the actual cost of the units is almost 1.6. The most we can actually give the project is the $1,193,683 based on the maximum project subsidy. That's the maximum home investment. 2 other things that I'd like to point out about this sheet. In some cases, we might not know what the proposed home investment is initially. Instead, we're doing the units to dollars approach that we talked about earlier. If we're doing that, you can leave this blank, and what we would find is the units that we've designated, again, have a cost of 1.6 almost. The maximum project subsidy is the 1.1, so the lesser of those 2 numbers is what's going to show up down here. We would still have to underwrite the project and only fill the gap. Let's say we determined that that gap was only $900,000. If that was the case, and we know that now, we go back through the sheet and we realize the maximum home investment is $900,000. One other thing to note is that in the spreadsheet, the way it first comes out, there are several hidden rows Most projects are going to be able to work just fine by designating up to 10 units. But if you need more, we have as many as 20 units that you can list. You simply unhide those additional rows. There's a little note here for you about how to do that. So that is the standard method sheet, and that's how you fill it out. In our next segment, we will be talking about proration.